A single unanswered question can unravel everything we believe about the past. What if the most disturbing mysteries ever recorded were never meant to be solved? Strange disappearances, impossible clues, and silent evidence keep resurfacing where they shouldn't. The truth feels close, yet something ensures it never fully emerges. On a cold afternoon in May 1828, the streets of Nuremberg were unsettled by an unusual figure emerging into public view. A young man stood unsteadily in the town square, his movements uncertain, as if the world itself was unfamiliar to him. His clothes were worn, his speech fragmented, and in his hand he carried a letter addressed to a cavalry captain. With that appearance began one of Europe's most enduring enigmas, the case of Kaspar Hauser. The letter claimed the boy had been raised in complete isolation, confined to a dark space for as long as he could remember, with minimal human contact. According to its contents, he had been provided only basic sustenance and the most rudimentary guidance in writing his name. Whether this account was truthful, exaggerated, or deliberately constructed remains one of the earliest uncertainties in the case. The man himself seemed almost detached from the ordinary rhythms of society, as though light, language, and space were still foreign concepts. In the days that followed, Kaspar Hauser became both a curiosity and a subject of scientific interest. Residents of Nuremberg observed him with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. He appeared childlike in many ways, yet capable of learning with remarkable speed. Teachers and physicians attempted to document his progress, noting his unusual sensitivities. Bright lights caused distress, certain sounds overwhelmed him, and even simple social interactions seemed to require immense effort. Yet beneath this surface narrative of a feral child adapting to civilization, inconsistencies began to emerge. Some observers believed his condition was genuine, a rare case of extreme isolation producing developmental delay. Others, however, questioned whether his behavior was too theatrical, too carefully aligned with expectations of what such a victim might look like. Could it be that the mystery was not only in his origins, but in the possibility that his origins were being performed? As his fame spread, Kaspar Hauser was moved between households and institutions, each attempting to educate and observe him. He learned to read and write more fluently, and his accounts of his supposed confinement became more structured. He described a dim environment, an unseen caretaker, and a life without clear memory of time. Yet no physical evidence of the place he described was ever found, and no witness could confirm its existence. This gap between testimony and verification opened the door to competing interpretations. Some early investigators suggested that he might have been the victim of an illegal custody arrangement, hidden for unknown reasons. Others proposed that he had been deliberately abandoned and later discovered. More speculative voices went further, suggesting that he might have been connected to aristocratic lineage, hidden away to protect or control inheritance claims. These theories, while never proven, reflected the broader uncertainty surrounding identity and power in early 19th century Europe. Medical examinations of the time could not provide definitive answers. Physicians debated whether his physical and psychological traits were consistent with long-term confinement. Some argued that his motor skills and cognition were too developed for someone with his claimed history. Others countered that human adaptability, even under extreme deprivation, was still not fully understood. In this space of incomplete science, interpretation often replaced certainty. What makes the case particularly compelling is not only what was observed, but what could never be confirmed. No clear record of his early childhood exists. No verifiable witnesses to his alleged imprisonment ever came forward. Even the letter that accompanied him has been questioned for its origin and authenticity. Each piece of evidence, when examined closely, seems to dissolve into ambiguity. Years later, Kaspar Hauser's life took a darker turn. In 1833, he was found gravely wounded in Ansbach, claiming he had been attacked by an unknown assailant. He described being lured under false pretenses before suffering a fatal injury. Yet once again, the details of the event resisted clarity. The location, the motive, and even the identity of the attacker remained unresolved. 3 days later, he died from his injuries, leaving behind more questions than answers. The circumstances of his death intensified speculation. Some believed it was an attempt to silence him, suggesting that his origins were tied to powerful individuals or institutions unwilling to let the truth emerge. Others argued the attack may have been self-inflicted or staged, part of a psychological pattern that had been misunderstood throughout his life. The lack of definitive forensic evidence ensured that neither explanation could fully prevail. In the decades that followed, historians and researchers revisited the case repeatedly. Archives were searched, testimonies re-evaluated, and earlier medical notes reinterpreted through modern perspectives. Psychological theories emerged, suggesting dissociative identity, fabricated memory, or social manipulation. At the same time, more romanticized interpretations persisted, portraying him as a lost prince or hidden heir, ideas that continued to capture public imagination despite the absence of proof. Modern analysis tends to approach the case with caution. The consensus among many scholars leans toward the possibility of deception, either by Hauser himself or by those who shaped his narrative. Yet even this conclusion does not fully resolve the inconsistencies. Certain behavioral details, documented at the time, still resist easy explanation. Why did so many independent observers describe him in similar terms? Why did his development follow such an unusual trajectory? And why, after nearly 2 centuries, does no definitive origin story hold up under scrutiny? Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Kaspar Hauser case is not the lack of answers, but the abundance of partial ones. Each explanation accounts for some elements while failing to encompass others. Each theory resolves one contradiction only to introduce another. It is as if the story itself refuses to settle into a single stable form. Standing back from the historical record, one is left with an image that is both precise and incomplete. A young man stepping into a world he claimed never to have known, surrounded by observers who could never fully determine who he was or where he came from. Was he a victim of concealment, a product of psychological complexity, or an elaborate fabrication that took on a life of its own? Even now, in the quiet spaces between documented facts and unanswered questions, the figure of Kaspar Hauser remains suspended, neither fully explained nor entirely dismissed. And so the question lingers, unchanged by time or investigation. How much of what we know about him is truth, and how much is still waiting, silently, to be uncovered? The unanswered questions surrounding Kaspar Hauser leave behind a familiar kind of silence, one where identity dissolves into uncertainty and history refuses to settle into a single stable version of events. That same silence seems to echo again, but in a very different landscape, far from the stone streets of 19th century Europe. It shifts now toward wind, salt, and an endless horizon over water. Along the northern edge of the Gulf Coast of present-day Texas, near the shallow waters of Matagorda Bay, the land flattens into marsh and sand. It is a place where tides reshape the shoreline without warning, and where remnants of human presence are easily claimed by weather, time, and vegetation. Today, little remains to mark what once stood there, only faint archaeological traces, and the persistent weight of a question that has never fully faded. In the late 17th century, this coastline became the stage for one of the most troubled colonial ventures in North America. The French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, had set out to establish a foothold for France at the mouth of the Mississippi River. Instead, navigational errors and miscalculations carried his expedition hundreds of miles westward, deep into unfamiliar territory controlled by shifting alliances of indigenous groups and contested by European powers. By 1685, the expedition established a settlement known as Fort St. Louis. It was not the thriving colonial hub envisioned in France, but a fragile outpost struggling against scarcity, disease, and isolation. Supply ships failed to arrive as expected. Storms scattered provisions. Internal conflict and mistrust grew among settlers who found themselves stranded in an environment they were ill-prepared to endure. The colony's location, intended as strategic, became instead a liability. Far from established French support and surrounded by unfamiliar terrain, the settlers lived under constant pressure. Food shortages became severe. Illness spread. And as months turned into years, the original hope of expansion gave way to survival under increasingly uncertain conditions. Yet the most enduring mystery is not how the colony struggled, but what ultimately became of its survivors. By 1689, Spanish forces moving through the region, led by expeditions searching for foreign encroachment, arrived at the abandoned site. What they reportedly found at Fort St. Louis was not a functioning settlement, but ruins. Structures stood damaged or empty. Scattered remains suggested violence or sudden collapse. Some accounts describe human bones in the vicinity. Others mention abandoned tools, broken belongings, and signs of a community that had vanished abruptly. But there were no clear survivors. This absence immediately raised questions that have never fully been resolved. What happened to the men, women, and children who once occupied the settlement? Did they perish in a single catastrophic event, or did their disappearance unfold gradually, dispersing across the surrounding landscape? One widely accepted interpretation suggests that the colony was attacked by local indigenous groups, possibly the Karankawa, who inhabited the coastal region. Tensions between the settlers and indigenous populations had been documented, and violence in both directions was not uncommon in frontier conditions. In this view, the colony may have been overwhelmed, its survivors killed or taken during retaliatory conflict. Yet even this explanation remains incomplete, relying on limited and fragmented records. Another possibility considers the role of disease and starvation. Life at Fort St. Louis was precarious, and mortality rates were high. It is plausible that the colony simply diminished over time, its remaining members too few to sustain themselves or resist environmental pressures. In this scenario, survivors may have attempted to travel inland or along the coast, scattering into regions where their identities were eventually absorbed into other communities or lost entirely. There are also accounts, less certain, more fragmentary, suggesting that some survivors may have been taken and integrated into indigenous groups. In frontier conditions, captivity did not always mean execution. It could also lead to assimilation over time. Children, in particular, may have been more easily incorporated into new social structures. If this occurred, the identity of Fort St. Louis did not end in a single moment of disappearance, but rather dissolved gradually into other populations, leaving no clear trace in European records. Spanish reports from subsequent expeditions add further ambiguity. While they documented the destruction of the settlement, they did not consistently agree on what evidence remained. Some descriptions emphasize destruction and abandonment. Others hint at the possibility that survivors had left before the final collapse, moving away from the coastline into areas not yet mapped or controlled by European forces. Over time, interpretation of these events has continued to shift. Archaeological findings have confirmed the general location of the settlement and provided insight into daily life at the colony, but they have not definitively answered the question of its end. No mass graves conclusively tied to the colony have been identified. No clear records of survivors resurfacing in French or Spanish colonial documents have been verified. This absence of resolution has allowed more speculative ideas to emerge. Some suggest that survivors may have attempted an overland journey eastward, seeking Spanish settlements in what is now Louisiana or beyond, only to perish along the way. Others propose that environmental factors, storms, flooding, and coastal erosion may have erased physical evidence of what happened, effectively burying the final chapter beneath shifting terrain. There are even interpretations that frame the disappearance not as a single event, but as a fragmentation of identity itself. In this view, Fort St. Louis did not end. It dissolved. Individuals moved in different directions, some absorbed into indigenous communities, others lost to illness or isolation, their collective identity slowly erased by geography and time rather than a singular act of violence. Yet each explanation, no matter how carefully constructed, encounters the same limitation: the lack of definitive evidence. The coastline that once held the settlement has changed dramatically over centuries. Shorelines have shifted, sediment has buried structures, and the documentary record remains incomplete, shaped by the perspectives and limitations of those who witnessed only fragments of the aftermath. Standing at the edge of Matagorda Bay today, it is difficult to reconstruct the presence of a colony that once carried such ambition and fragility in equal measure. The wind moves across empty water, and the land offers no clear testimony of what occurred there. Instead, it leaves only traces, archaeological hints, historical reports, and unanswered questions layered over one another like sediment itself. Was the disappearance of the Salle colony survivors the result of sudden destruction, slow dissolution, or something more complex that unfolded beyond the reach of recorded history? And if any survivors did endure beyond the settlement's collapse, where did their stories ultimately go? Into forgotten communities, unmarked graves, or histories that were never written at all? Like so many mysteries that resist closure, this one does not end so much as it recedes, leaving behind a landscape that feels less like an answer and more like an invitation to keep searching. The uncertainty surrounding Fort St. Louis lingers like salt in the air, carried across centuries and coastlines. From the Gulf of Mexico's shifting sands, the narrative moves northward now, across a colder, rockier shoreline where the Atlantic meets the rugged edge of what is today the northeastern United States. Here, the water is darker, the tides stronger, and the wind carries a different kind of silence, one shaped by isolation rather than abandonment. On the coast of present-day Maine, near the mouth of the Sagadahoc River, a small island rises from the estuary, surrounded by forested wilderness and cold tidal currents. It is a place where fog gathers heavily in the early morning, blurring the line between sea and land. In the early 17th century, this remote landscape became the setting for one of the most fragile attempts at English settlement in North America, the colony known as Popham Colony. Established in 1607 under the sponsorship of the Virginia Company, the Popham Colony was intended to be a permanent foothold for English expansion in the New World. Unlike the better-known Jamestown settlement further south, Popham was conceived with strategic maritime ambitions in mind: control of trade routes, access to timber resources, and a northern counterbalance to rival European powers. Yet from its earliest months, the colony existed under conditions of uncertainty. The environment itself was unfamiliar and unforgiving. Winters arrived early and lingered longer than expected. Supply lines stretched across the Atlantic were unreliable. The settlers, numbering around 100, faced not only the challenges of construction and agriculture, but also the psychological strain of isolation at the edge of an unknown continent. The fort they built, known as Fort St. George, Popham Colony, stood as both a symbol of ambition and a barrier against an environment that seemed indifferent to their presence. And yet, unlike many colonial narratives defined by dramatic destruction or violent confrontation, the story of the Popham Colony carries a different kind of mystery. It is not primarily a story of what was destroyed, but of what was quietly abandoned. After just over a year of occupation, the colonists made a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. In 1608, the settlement was abandoned. The survivors returned to England, leaving behind structures, tools, and the physical imprint of a colony that had never fully taken root. There was no recorded catastrophic battle, no documented epidemic that explains a sudden collapse, no definitive account of a single triggering event. Instead, there is simply departure. What would cause an entire colonial project, supported by investment, planning, and political ambition, to be relinquished so quickly? Mainstream historical interpretation points to a combination of factors. Leadership instability played a significant role, particularly after the death of key figures associated with the colony's founding vision. Harsh winters tested morale and survival capacity. The logistical difficulty of sustaining a remote settlement without reliable resupply made long-term survival increasingly unlikely. In this reading, abandonment was not mysterious at all, but pragmatic, a calculated withdrawal from an unsustainable position. Yet even within this practical explanation, certain details resist full closure. Reports from the colony describe periods of intense cold that exceeded expectations, freezing rivers and limiting access to resources. Food shortages became increasingly severe. Relations with nearby indigenous groups, while not consistently hostile, were complex and shaped by mutual caution. Some accounts suggest moments of cooperation, while others hint at mistrust that limited deeper engagement. In such an environment, survival depended not only on resources, but on fragile human relationships that were still in the process of being formed. But why did Popham fail where other early settlements endured similar conditions? Jamestown, despite its own catastrophic hardships, persisted. Other colonial efforts adapted over time. Yet Popham was simply left behind, its structures dismantled in spirit if not entirely in form. The fort remained, but the community did not. Archaeological investigations at the site have revealed a remarkably brief occupation layer. Tools, ceramics, and construction materials suggest rapid building activity followed by sudden cessation. Unlike long-term settlements that show gradual adaptation, Popham's material record appears compressed, intense activity followed by near silence. It is this abruptness that continues to intrigue researchers. Some historians suggest that internal divisions among leadership may have played a decisive role. Competing visions for the colony's future could have created irreconcilable disagreements. Others emphasize the psychological weight of isolation. The settlers were not only physically removed from England, they were culturally and emotionally severed from it, inhabiting a landscape that offered no familiar reference points. But more speculative interpretations have also emerged over time, not as assertions, but as attempts to account for what documentation does not fully explain. One such idea considers whether the colony's abandonment may have been influenced by broader geopolitical concerns, shifting priorities in England that made continued investment in northern settlements less attractive. In this view, Popham was not defeated by environment or conflict, but quietly decommissioned by distance and political recalibration. Another perspective considers the possibility that environmental unpredictability played a greater role than recorded. The mouth of the Sagadahoc River is shaped by tides, storms, and seasonal extremes that can dramatically alter living conditions. It is not difficult to imagine a series of harsh winters and failed harvests tipping a fragile settlement toward unsustainability. Yet even this explanation does not fully capture why departure was so complete, so final, and so lacking in recorded internal dissent. And so the mystery persists not in dramatic absence, but in subdued erasure. There are no tales of disappearance into wilderness, no accounts of survivors lost beyond the frontier. Instead, there is simply a colony that existed briefly, then ceased to exist at all in practice. Walking the landscape today, one finds little to suggest the intensity of that brief occupation. The forest has reclaimed the land. The river continues its slow tidal rhythm. If structures remain beneath the soil, they are quiet, buried beneath centuries of sediment and vegetation. The site does not announce its history, it conceals it. Which raises a final question that has followed Popham Colony through centuries of interpretation. Was its abandonment truly a clear decision made by those who lived there? Or was it the result of pressures so layered and subtle that no single explanation can fully account for it? And if so, how many other early settlements, less documented, less remembered, ended not in catastrophe, but in quiet withdrawal that history has only partially preserved? The silence left behind at Popham Colony does not close the chapter. It simply shifts the weight of uncertainty forward. If a settlement could appear, function briefly, and then vanish from lived presence without catastrophe, then the boundary between survival and disappearance in early colonial history becomes less defined than it first seems. That ambiguity continues to echo as the narrative moves once again along the Atlantic world, where the next unanswered story waits not in destruction, but in movement, delay, and disappearance across distance. Further south along the same coastline, the early 17th century was a period of rapid experimentation in settlement. European powers were still learning how to exist in environments that resisted easy control or prediction. Ships arrived with expectations shaped by maps that left vast regions blank or speculative. On land, those expectations collided with terrain, weather, and human networks that were already deeply established long before European arrival. Within that broader pattern, Popham Colony stands out not for what was lost in violence, but for what was withdrawn without explanation that fully satisfies every layer of historical inquiry. Some historians describe it as a failure of endurance, others as a strategic retreat. But neither framing fully explains the emotional and logistical finality of its departure. Structures were left behind, but intention was removed entirely. And that distinction, between abandoning a place and abandoning a possibility, remains difficult to separate. Contemporary records from the Virginia Company indicate shifting priorities in England during this period. Attention increasingly turned toward more southerly settlements, where climates appeared more favorable and agricultural prospects more stable. Jamestown, despite its own severe struggles, began to receive sustained investment. In contrast, northern ventures like Popham faded from strategic focus. Yet even this explanation, grounded in political and economic logic, leaves behind a quieter question. Why did Popham not evolve into something else, rather than end? Archaeological evidence offers partial insight. Excavations reveal a settlement that was actively constructed with intent, carefully planned fortifications, organized building efforts, and imported materials suggesting confidence at the outset. But the abruptness of its occupational layer suggests that daily life there never transitioned into long-term stability. There is no gradual architectural expansion, no extended rebuilding phase, no visible adaptation to seasonal cycles. Instead, the material record compresses into a short span of intense activity, followed by cessation. This pattern has led some researchers to consider environmental unpredictability not as a background factor, but as a decisive force. The main coastline is shaped by extremes that are not always immediately visible to newcomers. Winters can be harsher than anticipated, and the timing of resource availability can shift dramatically from year to year. For a settlement still dependent on supply chains crossing the Atlantic, even small miscalculations could accumulate into existential pressure. Yet, environmental explanation alone struggles to account for the speed and completeness of abandonment. Why was there no attempt to return seasonally? Why no gradual reoccupation or partial persistence? Why did the colony not persist in diminished form, as many early settlements did elsewhere? Here, interpretation begins to widen again. Some historians point to leadership dynamics within the colony. Early colonial ventures were often fragile political ecosystems, where authority depended as much on consensus as on formal appointment. Disagreements over governance, resource allocation, or long-term strategy could fracture cohesion quickly. If confidence in leadership eroded, abandonment may have become not only practical, but inevitable. Others consider the psychological dimension more closely. Isolation in unfamiliar landscapes, especially during extended winter conditions, can reshape decision-making in ways that written records struggle to capture. The experience of distance from familiar structures, legal, cultural, emotional, may have contributed to a collective reassessment of viability. In this reading, the departure from Popham is not sudden, but gradually assembled from accumulated doubt. Still, there remains a quieter strand of speculation that does not challenge the facts, but questions what those facts fully represent. Some interpretations suggest that early colonial ventures were not always abandoned in binary terms. Instead, they may have transitioned into informal or undocumented phases, partial occupations, temporary returns, or unrecorded engagements with surrounding regions. If such movements occurred at Popham, they left no clear documentary trace, only absence. And absence, in historical terms, is not always empty. It can be structured. It can be shaped by what was not recorded, what was deemed unimportant, or what was lost through administrative discontinuity. The silence of Popham Colony, therefore, may not only reflect physical departure, but archival limitation. Standing at this intersection of interpretation, the colony becomes less a closed episode and more a question about how disappearance is defined. Is a settlement considered ended when people leave, when records stop, or when memory no longer sustains continuity? The coastline where Popham once stood continues to erode and reform under tidal pressure. What was once structured wood and human intention has returned to earth and water. Yet the historical question remains intact, unchanged by time. Did the colony truly end in 1608? Or did it simply slip beyond the reach of the records that were capable of preserving it? And if such a complete but quiet disappearance was possible here, what other beginnings and endings along this coast might still be waiting, unrecognized, just beyond the limits of what history was able to hold? The quiet disappearance of Popham Colony leaves behind a familiar kind of historical silence, one shaped not by sudden catastrophe, but by departure, uncertainty, and the limits of what was recorded. That silence does not remain confined to the American coastline. It echoes outward, across oceans and centuries, toward another vast and unforgiving landscape where disappearance takes a very different form. Far to the north, beyond the reach of temperate seas and settled coastlines, the Arctic holds its own archive of unresolved questions. Ice does not simply preserve, it obscures, shifts, and sometimes erases entirely. In this environment, where sound is absorbed by snow and distance stretches perception itself, one of the most enduring enigmas of exploration history begins to take shape. The fate of the final provisions and sealed records associated with the ill-fated Franklin expedition. In the mid-19th century, two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set out under the command of Sir John Franklin to chart and navigate the remaining unknown sections of the Northwest Passage. What they carried was not only the hope of mapping a new maritime route, but also carefully prepared supplies, scientific instruments, and official documentation intended to be preserved even in the event of disaster. Among these materials, historians have long speculated about the existence of what has come to be referred to as the Franklin Relic Cache, a presumed collection of preserved records, navigational logs, personal effects, and possibly even sealed reports intended to document the expedition's progress or final circumstances. Unlike confirmed artifacts recovered from later searches, this cache has never been definitively located. The terrain where the expedition vanished is not static. The Arctic archipelago shifts slowly but constantly under pressure from ice movement and seasonal thaw. Islands appear and recede from accessibility. Ice flows carry objects across vast distances. In such an environment, even well-documented sites can become unreachable for decades at a time. It is within this unstable geography that the mystery of the missing cache persists. Initial search efforts following the disappearance of the Franklin expedition in the 1840s focused on survival and route reconstruction. Rescue missions encountered scattered evidence, abandoned camps, skeletal remains, and fragments of equipment. Some of these findings provided partial insight into the fate of the crews, suggesting prolonged retreat southward and eventual collapse under extreme conditions. Yet the more structured records, the kind expected to be stored carefully, protected from weather and time, were notably absent. This absence has led to a persistent question among historians and Arctic researchers. If the expedition maintained formal documentation during its final phase, where did those records go? Mainstream interpretation suggests several possibilities. One is that official logs and documents may have been lost during sudden evacuations of icebound ships. Another is that materials were deliberately destroyed or abandoned during survival-driven retreats over land and ice. In this view, the cache may never have existed as a single preserved collection, but rather as dispersed fragments lost to environment and circumstance. Yet the structured expectations of the Royal Navy at the time complicate this explanation. Expeditions of this scale were typically required to maintain detailed records, often stored in designated locations aboard ship. These records were considered essential not only for navigation and science, but for institutional accountability. This raises the possibility that at least some portion of these materials survived longer than the ships themselves. The question then shifts from whether the cache existed to where it might have gone. Over time, search expeditions, particularly those in the late 19th and 20th centuries, recovered increasingly detailed evidence of the expedition's final movements. Sites on King William Island and surrounding regions revealed traces of prolonged encampments, suggesting that crews abandoned their ships and attempted overland travel. Yet despite extensive archaeological investigation, no definitive archive of written records has ever been recovered. Some researchers propose that environmental conditions played a decisive role. Permafrost, shifting ice pressure, and seasonal melt cycles could easily destroy paper-based materials, especially if exposed during prolonged exposure to the elements. In this interpretation, the missing cache is not hidden. It is degraded beyond recognition, dispersed into soil and ice over nearly 2 centuries. However, other interpretations remain cautiously open to less certain possibilities. There are hypotheses suggesting that some materials may have been intentionally concealed. If members of the expedition recognized the inevitability of failure, they may have chosen to preserve key documents by sealing them in locations intended to withstand short-term exposure. These could include stone cairns, buried containers, or protected coastal sites designed to be recovered later. The challenge, of course, is that the Arctic landscape is not stable in the way such intentions would require. What is hidden in one season may be relocated or buried in another. A further line of speculation considers human agency beyond the expedition itself. Indigenous Inuit oral histories, collected in later years, describe encounters with stranded sailors and abandoned sites containing European materials. Some accounts reference objects being moved, repurposed, or integrated into local survival practices. While these narratives do not specifically confirm the existence of a centralized cache, they introduce the possibility that items from the expedition were redistributed across multiple locations rather than remaining in a single recoverable site. In this fragmented context, the idea of a relic cache becomes less a physical object and more a conceptual reconstruction, a way of organizing the expectation that something important must have been preserved, even if it cannot be found in one place. modern Arctic archaeology continues to refine the map of the expedition's final movements. Advances in underwater surveying and ice edge exploration have revealed additional ship remains, including remarkably well-preserved sections of hull and equipment. Yet even with these discoveries, the documentary core of the expedition, its written record, remains elusive. Why would such materials remain missing when so much physical evidence has survived? The answer may lie in the nature of Arctic preservation itself. While cold conditions can preserve organic material, they can also fracture, displace, and obscure objects over time. Ice movement can transport artifacts far from their original location. Seasonal thaw can expose and then rebury materials repeatedly. In such a system, preservation does not guarantee recoverability. Still, the absence of definitive records continues to shape interpretation. Without them, the final decisions, observations, and experiences of the Franklin expedition remain partially inaccessible. The narrative is reconstructed from fragments, physical remains, second-hand accounts, and environmental evidence, but never completed in the form the expedition itself may have intended. And so the idea of the missing cache persists, not as confirmed artifact, but as unresolved possibility. It invites a broader question about exploration and memory. How much of what is lost in extreme environments is truly gone, and how much simply moves beyond the boundaries of retrieval? If a sealed record did survive the final days of the expedition, where would it be now? Buried beneath shifting ice, embedded in coastal sediment, or scattered across sites that have yet to be discovered? Or has the Arctic, in its slow and indifferent motion, already rewritten the archive entirely, leaving only traces of what once was and questions that still resist closure? The possibility that the Franklin expedition's missing records may already be dispersed across the Arctic landscape introduces a different way of thinking about disappearance itself. Rather than a single lost cache waiting in darkness or ice, the idea begins to resemble something more fragmented, an archive that was never truly contained, but gradually redistributed across a region that does not preserve boundaries in a human sense. As earlier search efforts pushed deeper into the Arctic archipelago, explorers often reported encountering sites that suggested layered occupation. Some locations showed evidence of temporary camps, then abandonment, then later disturbance by environmental forces or passing groups. In such conditions, any structured collection of documents, if it ever existed, would have faced repeated cycles of exposure, movement, and burial. Even carefully sealed materials would not remain fixed in place for long. The ships themselves, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, eventually became central reference points for reconstructing the expedition's final phase. Their wrecks, discovered centuries later in remarkably preserved condition, confirmed that large portions of the expedition ended trapped in ice rather than at sea in open water. Yet even these discoveries did not resolve the question of documentation. The physical ships survived in partial silence, but the narrative records they once carried did not reappear alongside them. This separation between material survival and informational loss is one of the most striking features of the Franklin mystery. Objects endure where written intent disappears. Iron, wood, and structure remain recognizable, while journals, logs, and personal accounts vanish without clear trace. It creates a kind of historical imbalance, one where the physical world offers fragments, but the interpretive world remains incomplete. Some researchers have suggested that the missing materials may have been separated early, during the expedition's transition from ship-based survival to overland retreat. If crews abandoned the vessels under pressure, they would have faced immediate decisions about what to carry. Weight, mobility, and survival priorities would have dictated what could be preserved. In that scenario, official logs and scientific records, though valuable, may have been sacrificed in favor of food, tools, or navigation essentials. But this explanation, while practical, does not fully account for the absence of even partial documentation. In many historical shipwrecks and Arctic disasters, fragments of written material tend to survive. Pages, notes, or personal journals preserved in pockets, containers, or sealed compartments. The Franklin expedition, by contrast, has yielded remarkably little in this regard. This discrepancy has encouraged more speculative interpretations, not as certainty, but as attempts to fill gaps left by physical evidence. One such idea considers whether portions of the expedition's records may have been deliberately hidden in anticipation of recovery. If crew members believed rescue was possible, they may have attempted to preserve documents in locations intended to be found later. Cairns, buried containers, or marked sites could have served as temporary repositories. Yet the Arctic does not preserve intention in stable form. Snowdrifts erase markers. Ice shifts landmarks. What is placed with clarity in one season can become indistinguishable in the next. A cache designed for retrieval could easily become unrecognizable within a short span of time, especially under prolonged environmental pressure. Another perspective shifts attention away from intentional concealment and toward redistribution through survival activity. Indigenous Inuit accounts collected during later exploration periods describe encounters with stranded sailors and abandoned materials along coastal regions. Some narratives suggest that objects from the expedition were observed in multiple locations over time, sometimes integrated into local survival practices or repurposed for practical use. While these accounts do not directly reference a centralized archive, they introduce a different possibility: that the expedition's material record was never unified in one place after abandonment. Instead, it may have been dispersed through a combination of movement, exchange, and environmental transport. In that sense, the missing cache would not be missing in location, but in coherence. Modern archaeological interpretation often avoids committing to any single explanation. Instead, it emphasizes process, how materials move, degrade, and reappear under Arctic conditions. Ice can carry objects across long distances. Freeze-thaw cycles can fracture storage containers. Coastal erosion can expose sites briefly before reburial. Over nearly 2 centuries, these processes create a landscape where evidence is constantly in motion. Even the most promising discoveries in recent decades, including well-preserved sections of the expedition's ships, have not altered this fundamental uncertainty. The recovery of physical structures confirms presence and condition, but not the recovery of narrative documentation. The silence remains intact where written explanation should have been. This distinction matters because it changes the nature of the mystery itself. It is no longer only about what happened to the expedition, but about what kinds of knowledge can survive extreme environments. Physical endurance does not guarantee informational continuity, and in the case of the Franklin expedition, that separation is almost absolute. If any portion of the missing record still exists, it may no longer resemble an archive in any traditional sense. It may exist as fragments embedded in sediment layers, or as isolated artifacts separated from their original context. It may have been moved so far from its origin point that it is no longer recognizable as part of a single collection. The Arctic silence leaves behind a strange kind of residue, evidence that survives without explanation, records without continuity, presence without narrative closure. And as the search for the Franklin expedition's missing record fades into the frozen distance, the question of vanished testimony does not disappear with it. Instead, it reemerges in a very different landscape, where ice gives way to heat, stone replaces snow, and silence is carried not by wind, but by distance across desert and grassland. Far to the south, in the rolling frontier of 18th century New Spain, the land of present-day Texas stretches outward in long, open plains, broken by rivers, dry brush, and shifting horizons. It is a landscape that offers little protection and even less certainty. In the mid-1700s, This region became the setting for a mission whose story would end not only in destruction, but in something far more elusive: the disappearance of those who were meant to witness what happened. At the edge of the frontier stood Mission San Sabá, established in 1757 near the San Sabá River. Its purpose was both religious and strategic, an attempt to convert and ally with local indigenous groups, while also extending Spanish influence deeper into contested territory. Built from stone, timber, and hope, the mission was isolated from major colonial centers, dependent on fragile supply routes and uncertain alliances. Nearby, a supporting military installation, Presidio San Sabá, was constructed to provide protection. Yet even this presence was limited, stretched thin across a frontier where communication was slow and reinforcement unpredictable. The mission existed in a delicate balance, between ambition and exposure, between intention and vulnerability. In March 1758, that balance collapsed. A large force of indigenous warriors, often identified in historical accounts as members of the Comanche and allied groups, approached the mission. What followed was a coordinated attack that overwhelmed the settlement and its defenses. The mission was destroyed. Structures were burned or dismantled. Survivors, where they existed, were scattered or killed. The event was swift, decisive, and well documented in its immediate aftermath by Spanish colonial records. But within those records lies a quieter, more difficult mystery, one that does not center on the destruction itself, but on what was reported, recorded, and then partially lost in transmission. The accounts of witnesses who were present at the time, and then, in later retellings, seem to vanish from the narrative entirely. These witnesses were not a single group, but rather a collection of individuals: soldiers stationed at the Presidio, clergy attached to the mission, indigenous converts, and travelers who passed through the region. They were the ones who observed the unfolding tension, the early signs of conflict, and the final moments before collapse. Yet when historians later reconstructed the event, many of these perspectives appeared fragmented, incomplete, or absent altogether. Official Spanish reports describe the attack in detail, emphasizing the scale of destruction and the strategic failure it represented. They note the burning of structures, the loss of life, and the abandonment of the mission site. But personal accounts, diaries, letters, and first-hand testimonies that would normally accompany such an event are unusually sparse. In some cases, references are made to individuals whose statements were recorded, but whose original writings no longer survive or were never fully preserved. This absence has led historians to an unusual question. Were the witnesses lost because they perished, or because their records were never fully transmitted into the archival system that preserved colonial history? Mainstream interpretation suggests a combination of factors. The frontier conditions of New Spain meant that documentation was often inconsistent. Records could be delayed, damaged, or lost in transit between missions, presidios, and administrative centers. In such environments, even significant events might be recorded only in summary form, with individual voices compressed into official summaries. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the unevenness of what remains. Some events from the same period are richly documented, with detailed correspondence and multiple overlapping accounts. The destruction of Mission San Sabá, by contrast, is known primarily through a narrower set of records, with fewer surviving personal narratives than might be expected for an event of such scale. This imbalance has opened space for alternative interpretations, not as replacement narratives, but as attempts to understand what might have interrupted the flow of testimony itself. One possibility considers the chaos of the aftermath. In the wake of the attack, survivors may have been dispersed across great distances, taken to other settlements or military posts where immediate survival took precedence over documentation. In such conditions, the priority would not have been recording testimony, but re-establishing safety and stability. Witness accounts may have been given verbally but never formally preserved. Another perspective suggests that administrative filtering may have played a role. Colonial systems of record-keeping often prioritized official interpretation over individual narrative. In this process, personal testimonies could be condensed, paraphrased, or absorbed into broader reports. Over time, the original voices may have been effectively erased, not through destruction, but through institutional compression. There is also the question of indigenous perspectives, which are often present in fragments rather than continuous records. Oral histories from the region describe conflict, movement, and shifting territorial boundaries during this period. However, these accounts were not consistently integrated into Spanish archival systems, leaving a parallel record that exists outside the written colonial narrative. If witnesses from indigenous communities observed the events at San Sabá, their testimonies may have been preserved in forms that were never formally translated into European documentation. Within this layered absence, the idea of vanished witnesses begins to take on a broader meaning. It is no longer only about individuals disappearing physically, but about perspectives disappearing structurally, through the way history was recorded, transmitted, and preserved. Archaeological investigations at the mission site have confirmed the scale of destruction. Burn layers, structural collapse, and artifact distribution all align with accounts of a violent attack. Yet archaeology, like documentary history, struggles to recover voice. It can show where buildings stood and how they fell, but not always who stood within them, or what they saw in their final moments. This limitation creates a gap between event and experience. The destruction of Mission San Sabá is well established as a historical fact. What remains uncertain is the fullness of human perception surrounding it, the details of observation, fear, decision, and survival that rarely survive intact in any record system. Some researchers have suggested that this gap is not unique to San Sabá, but characteristic of frontier history more broadly. In regions where political control was unstable and communication networks were stretched across vast distances, documentation often failed to capture the full complexity of events. Witnesses did not always vanish physically. Sometimes they simply fell outside the mechanisms that preserved their accounts. And yet, the sense of absence persists. Standing amid the reconstructed outlines of the mission today, one is confronted not only with what was destroyed, but with what cannot be fully reconstructed. The land does not retain testimony. It retains only traces, stone foundations, scattered artifacts, and the faint geometry of what once stood there. Which raises a final, lingering question. When history speaks of vanished witnesses at San Sabá, are we referring to people who were lost in the violence of 1758, or to voices that were never fully allowed to remain within the historical record itself? And if those voices still exist somewhere, fragmented, displaced, or unrecognized, what would it take to hear them again after more than 2 centuries of silence? The silence surrounding Mission San Sabá does not end with the destruction of stone and timber. Instead, it extends into something more elusive, the fading of testimony itself, where events remain known, but the human texture of those events becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct. As the historical trail grows thinner in the aftermath of 1758, the question is no longer only what happened at the mission, but what was lost in the act of recording it. In the immediate years following the attack, Spanish colonial administration focused on stabilization. Reports were compiled, military responses organized, and frontier defenses reassessed. The destruction of Mission San Sabá was treated as both a strategic failure and a warning about the volatility of the northern frontier. Yet even in these structured responses, something subtle begins to appear. Repetition without depth, summaries without voices, conclusions without sustained testimony. The individuals who had been present, soldiers, missionaries, laborers, and indigenous converts, are often referenced in collective terms rather than as fully preserved witnesses. Names appear in some documents, then vanish in others. Statements are summarized rather than quoted. Entire sequences of observation are condensed into administrative language that prioritizes outcome over experience. This process raises a quiet but important question. When a witness is recorded only through summary, is their testimony preserved or transformed into something else entirely? Some historians suggest that this compression was not unusual for frontier reporting. In regions far from central archives, documentation often passed through multiple hands before reaching formal record-keeping institutions. Along the way, details could be lost, altered, or deemed unnecessary. What survives is not always the original voice, but a filtered interpretation of it. Yet San Sabá stands out because of the unevenness of what remains. Other contemporary events in New Spain produced extensive correspondence, including personal reflections and detailed narrative accounts. In contrast, the documentation surrounding the mission's destruction feels strangely incomplete, as though the chain of testimony was interrupted at multiple points. This has led some researchers to consider the possibility that the vanishing of witnesses may not refer only to physical disappearance, but to a breakdown in the transmission of their accounts. If survivors were relocated quickly after the attack, their experiences may have been absorbed into other settlements where record-keeping priorities differed. In such cases, testimony could have been shared orally but never formally archived. Others propose a more structural explanation, that the frontier system itself was not designed to preserve individual narrative continuity. Instead, it prioritized administrative clarity, what happened, where it happened, and what action followed. In that framework, personal experience becomes secondary, even if it was originally documented in more detailed form. But there is another layer that occasionally appears in later interpretations, drawn from fragments of indigenous oral tradition and regional memory. Some accounts describe movements of people through the area following the attack, displacement, regrouping, and shifting patterns of settlement. These narratives do not always align neatly with Spanish administrative records, but they suggest that the aftermath of San Sabá may have involved a more extended and complex human dispersal than official reports fully captured. If witnesses moved beyond the boundaries of colonial oversight, their experiences may have continued in forms that were never reintegrated into written archives. Memory in such contexts does not disappear. It changes medium. It becomes localized, adapted, and embedded in different cultural frameworks. But once separated from the archival system that first recorded it, it becomes difficult for historians to reassemble in its original form. Archaeological work at and around Presidio San Sabá has reinforced the physical reality of the event. Burn patterns, artifact distribution, and structural collapse confirm the intensity of the attack and the rapid abandonment that followed. Yet, as with many frontier sites, archaeology reveals action without fully restoring perspective. It shows where people were, but not always what they saw or how they interpreted what they experienced. This gap between physical evidence and narrative continuity is where the mystery of the vanished witnesses becomes most pronounced. The event itself is not in doubt. The destruction is well documented. What remains uncertain is the continuity of human observation, the chain of perception that should connect experience to record and record to history. Some interpretations suggest that this chain was simply broken by circumstance. Others suggest it was never fully stable in the first place. On the frontier, documentation was not a guaranteed process, but a fragile one, dependent on distance, resources, and institutional attention. A witness might speak, but whether that speech became preserved text was never assured. And so the question shifts again, subtly but significantly. We are no longer only asking where the witnesses went. We are asking how witness itself survives under conditions where recording systems are incomplete, uneven, or delayed. In this sense, the vanished witnesses of San Sabá may represent something broader than a single historical incident. They may represent the limits of archival memory itself, the point at which human experience exceeds the structures built to preserve it. Today, the landscape around the former mission is quiet. Grassland stretches across ground that once held walls, corridors, and gathered lives. There is no visible trace of testimony, only the absence of it. And yet, absence is not the same as emptiness. It is structured by what was once present and what was once seen, which leaves one final, lingering question at the edge of this history. If the witnesses of San Sabá did not truly vanish, but were instead dispersed between survival, memory, and incomplete record, then how much of what we consider known about the event is shaped not by what was observed, but by what history was able to retain? The silence left behind at Mission San Sabá does not remain confined to the burned foundations of a single frontier outpost. It becomes part of a wider pattern, one where testimony thins, records fragment, and entire human experiences seem to dissolve at the edges of documented history. As we move along the southeastern arc of North America, that same pattern begins to reappear, not in the ruins of a mission or a military fort, but along a coastline shaped by tides, marsh, and memory that predates European arrival. The Atlantic shoreline south of present-day Georgia is a place where land and water blur into one another without clear boundaries. Salt marshes stretch for miles, broken by narrow rivers and shifting islands that change shape with the seasons. Fog settles low across the water, and in the early morning light, it can be difficult to distinguish solid ground from reflection. It is here, among these quiet in-between spaces, that one of the lesser-known but deeply persistent frontier mysteries takes form: the story of the so-called hidden settlements along the Guale coast. Long before European contact, this region was inhabited by the Guale people, part of a complex network of indigenous communities who had lived along the Atlantic seaboard for centuries. Their settlements were not static in the European sense, but adapted to environmental cycles, resource availability, and seasonal movement. Villages shifted over time, sometimes relocating inland, sometimes returning closer to the coast. Archaeological evidence shows continuity, adaptation, and resilience rather than fixed permanence. When Spanish missions expanded into the region during the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered this landscape of movement and adaptation. Among the most significant of these settlements was Mission Santa Catalina de Guale, established on what is now St. Catherine's Island. It became a focal point of colonial interaction, where conversion efforts, labor systems, and cultural exchange unfolded over generations. Nearby coastal regions, including what historians refer to broadly as the Guale Coast, became dotted with additional mission sites and auxiliary settlements. These were not always large or permanent in the European architectural sense. Some were modest clusters of structures, wood, thatch, and earth, built close to existing indigenous communities. Others were more formalized mission complexes tied to Spanish colonial administration. And yet, despite the relative documentation of these missions, there are persistent gaps in the historical record, periods where settlements are mentioned, then disappear from written accounts, only to reappear indirectly years later in altered form. It is within these gaps that the idea of a hidden colony has occasionally emerged in historical discussion, not as a confirmed site, but as a pattern of absence that invites interpretation. In some early Spanish reports, references are made to smaller satellite communities or relocated groups associated with mission systems. These references are often vague, sometimes describing villages moved inland or communities no longer at their former sites. Over time, such descriptions have led historians to consider whether certain settlements along the Guale coast were relocated, absorbed, or simply abandoned in ways that were never fully recorded. Mainstream interpretation tends to frame these absences as administrative and environmental in nature. Coastal conditions were unstable, and missions were frequently affected by storms, resource shortages, and shifting political priorities. Additionally, the relationship between Spanish authorities and indigenous communities was complex and often unstable, leading to periods of relocation, consolidation, or restructuring of mission populations. From this perspective, what appears as a hidden colony is not a single lost settlement, but a series of transitions, communities moving between locations, merging with others, or dissolving into broader regional networks. The absence of continuous records reflects the instability of frontier administration rather than the existence of a concealed or unknown colony. Yet the archaeological record introduces subtler questions. Excavations across barrier islands and coastal mainland sites in Georgia have revealed evidence of repeated occupation layers, structures built, modified, abandoned, and rebuilt over time. In some locations, there are signs of habitation that do not align neatly with known mission timelines. Post holes, ceramics, and fragmented European materials appear in contexts that suggest temporary or undocumented presence. These findings do not confirm the existence of an unknown colony, but they do suggest a landscape of more fluid settlement patterns than written records alone indicate. In some cases, material evidence appears at sites that are not clearly named in surviving Spanish documentation, raising questions about whether all settlements were consistently recorded or whether some existed outside formal administrative recognition. This is where the concept of a hidden colony becomes more interpretive than literal. Some researchers have proposed that certain groups, whether displaced mission populations, mixed communities, or relocated indigenous settlements, may have formed semi-permanent clusters along less accessible parts of the coast. These would not necessarily have functioned as formal colonies in the European sense, but rather as adaptive communities operating between established mission systems and independent settlement. Such arrangements would have been difficult to document consistently, especially if they existed in transitional or unofficial states. Spanish colonial records tended to prioritize missions and presidios as fixed points of reference. Anything outside that framework could easily become fragmented in the archival record. In this context, hidden does not necessarily mean secret. It may simply mean unrecorded in a way that survived intact. Indigenous oral histories from the broader southeastern region add another dimension, though they are not always directly tied to specific archaeological sites. These traditions often emphasize movement, adaptation, and continuity rather than fixed settlement boundaries. Communities shift locations in response to environmental and social pressures, maintaining identity across space rather than anchoring it to a single permanent site. When viewed alongside archaeological evidence, this creates a picture of a coastline that was not static, but continuously reorganized over time. Settlements appear, shift, and dissolve in ways that may not correspond to the expectations of European documentation systems. Still, the question remains: why do some gaps in the record feel more pronounced than others? There are moments in the historical sequence where settlements are referenced with relative clarity, and then, within a few decades, become difficult to trace with certainty. This is not unusual in frontier regions, but it does raise interpretive challenges. Did these communities relocate further inland? Were they consolidated into larger mission centers? Or did they simply transition into forms of settlement that were no longer recognized in the same administrative categories? The uncertainty is compounded by environmental change. Coastal erosion, rising sea levels over centuries, and shifting barrier island formations have altered the physical landscape significantly since the 17th century. Sites that once held settlements may now lie submerged, buried, or eroded beyond recognition. In such conditions, even well-established locations can become archaeologically elusive. Some speculative interpretations suggest that what appears as absence in the record might reflect not disappearance, but transformation. A community may persist while changing its structure, location, or cultural affiliation in ways that no longer match earlier descriptions. Over time, the continuity becomes difficult to trace through written records alone. In this sense, the idea of a hidden colony along the Guale coast may be less about a single undiscovered settlement and more about the limitations of how continuity itself is recorded. Archaeology, history, and oral tradition each capture different aspects of that continuity, but none can fully reconstruct it alone. What emerges instead is a layered landscape, one where settlement is not a fixed point, but a process that leaves uneven traces across time. Standing on the modern coastline today, the sense of impermanence is still present. Marsh grasses shift with the tide. Islands slowly reshape themselves. Water moves through channels that may not have existed centuries ago. It is not difficult to imagine how entire settlements, if built in such an environment, could become difficult to trace over time, not through dramatic disappearance, but through gradual environmental and historical transformation. And so the question remains open, resting at the intersection of archaeology and uncertainty. Along the Guale coast, are we looking at the remnants of a truly hidden colony, or at something more subtle, a continuous human presence that simply moved faster than the record-keeping systems capable of preserving its full story? If the latter is true, then what else along this coastline might still exist only in fragments, waiting not to be discovered, but to be understood differently? The idea of continuity that never fully enters the historical record lingers long after the Guale coast fades into the horizon of documented frontier history. It leaves behind a subtle tension between what is absent and what may have simply changed form. That same tension begins to surface again as the narrative shifts slightly inland and then outward along the wider southeastern frontier, where Spanish missions, indigenous communities, and shifting colonial boundaries created a landscape that was never truly fixed. Along this coastline and its adjoining rivers, movement was constant. Villages were relocated in response to seasonal cycles, trade routes evolved, and mission systems expanded or contracted depending on political stability and environmental conditions. Within this rhythm, settlements were not always meant to remain permanent. Some existed for decades, others for only a few years before dissolving into other configurations of life. It is within this fluid environment that references to scattered, poorly documented habitation begin to emerge in fragmented colonial records. Not as a single confirmed hidden colony, but as repeated mentions of communities that appear briefly in correspondence and then vanish from formal administrative mapping. These gaps do not form a clear pattern on their own, yet when viewed collectively, they suggest a frontier system that was far more dynamic than static maps would imply. At the center of this historical landscape stands Mission Santa Catalina de Guale, a focal point of sustained interaction between Spanish missionaries and indigenous Guale communities. Over time, the mission experienced cycles of stability and disruption, periods of growth followed by relocation, restructuring, and decline. Each transition carried people, objects, and memory into new spatial arrangements, often without fully preserved documentation. This process of relocation is key to understanding why the idea of a hidden colony persists in interpretation. It is not necessarily that a single settlement disappeared intact, but that the boundaries between settlements blurred over time. A village moved inland might retain its identity in oral tradition while disappearing from Spanish cartographic records. A mission population might merge with another community, leaving behind material traces that no longer align with its original designation. Archaeological surveys across coastal Georgia and adjacent regions support this sense of fluid occupation. Sites reveal overlapping layers of habitation, structures built, modified, abandoned, and later reoccupied in different forms. Ceramics of European origin appear alongside indigenous materials in contexts that suggest ongoing interaction rather than isolated occupation. Yet these material traces rarely align neatly with named settlements in written records. This mismatch between material evidence and documentary continuity is where interpretation becomes more complex. Some historians argue that what appears as missing settlements are the result of administrative limitations rather than physical disappearance. Spanish colonial systems were not always designed to track small or transitional communities with precision. Documentation tended to focus on mission centers and presidios, while peripheral or temporary settlements were recorded inconsistently. Over time, this creates an archival landscape where certain communities appear briefly and then fade from official memory without a clear endpoint. Others suggest that environmental factors played a significant role in shaping this documentary gap. The southeastern coastline is a dynamic system. Rivers shift course, barrier islands migrate, and marshland expands or recedes depending on long-term climatic patterns. A settlement located near a river mouth in one century may find itself separated from that waterway in the next. Such changes could force relocation or abandonment, leaving behind archaeological traces that are difficult to associate with specific historical names. Still, there remains a quieter interpretive thread that occasionally surfaces in scholarly discussion. The possibility that some communities existed in semi-autonomous or transitional states that did not fully enter colonial documentation at all. These would not necessarily be hidden in the deliberate sense, but rather situated outside the administrative focus of record-keeping systems. Their existence would be known indirectly, through trade, interaction, or reference, but not consistently documented as discrete entities. This idea does not suggest secrecy. Instead, it reflects the uneven nature of frontier observation itself. As colonial expansion continued, Spanish authorities increasingly consolidated mission systems. Smaller or less stable settlements were often absorbed into larger centers for logistical and defensive reasons. In this process, the identity of individual communities could be transformed without being explicitly recorded as such. A village that once appeared under one designation might later be listed only as part of a larger mission population, its earlier form effectively dissolved in administrative language. Over time, these shifts accumulate into what appears, from a modern perspective, as discontinuity. But within the lived reality of the period, they may have represented gradual adaptation rather than abrupt disappearance. And yet, the sensation of absence persists in the historical record. Why do certain settlements appear briefly in documents and then vanish without clear explanation? Why do archaeological layers sometimes suggest continuity where written records suggest interruption? And why does the coastline itself seem to preserve traces of human presence that no longer correspond to identifiable names or narratives? These questions do not lead toward a single answer. Instead, they point toward a broader structural issue: the difference between lived landscapes and recorded history. The Guale coast, like many frontier regions, was not a place of fixed boundaries. It was a system of movement, of people, resources, and seasonal adaptation. In such a system, permanence was not always the goal. What appears today as hidden may once have been fluid, visible in one context and absent in another depending on the perspective of the observer. Still, even this explanation does not fully resolve the lingering uncertainty. Archaeology continues to uncover sites that complicate simple narratives of settlement and abandonment. Oral traditions preserve forms of continuity that do not always map directly onto written colonial records, and environmental change continues to reshape the physical context in which all of this history is interpreted. Standing along the modern marshlands of coastal Georgia, where tidal water moves slowly through grass and mud, it becomes difficult to separate presence from absence. The land itself suggests both, structures that once existed and structures that may still lie beneath layers of sediment and time. Which leads to the final, unresolved question that follows this coastline like a quiet undertow. If parts of the Guale settlements were never truly lost, but instead transformed, relocated, or absorbed beyond the reach of formal records, then what exactly are we searching for when we speak of a hidden colony, and how much of it might still exist, not as disappearance, but as continuity we have not yet learned to recognize? The silence surrounding the Beale ciphers does not feel isolated. It echoes outward, as though every unanswered sequence of numbers is part of a broader pattern, one where information survives, but its origin slips just beyond reach. That same sensation appears again, though in a very different form, when we turn from encoded texts to the fragile beginnings of empire in the New World. Deep in the tropical lowlands of present-day Panama, where dense rainforest presses against riverbanks and humidity hangs in the air like a constant presence, there once stood a settlement that briefly held the hopes of an expanding empire. The land is thick with green, vines, towering canopy trees, and the constant movement of water carving paths through earth older than any recorded map of the region. It is a place where visibility is limited not by darkness, but by density. And within that environment, in the early 16th century, a city rose and then vanished from active memory: Santa María de la Antigua del Darién. Founded in 1510 by Spanish settlers under the leadership of Vasco Núñez de Balboa, this settlement is often described as the first permanent European town on the mainland of the Americas. It was not merely a military outpost, but a civic experiment, intended to serve as a base for further exploration, administration, and control of surrounding territories. For a brief period, it functioned as a center of colonial activity, governing interactions with indigenous populations and acting as a gateway between the Atlantic world and the vast, unknown interior. Yet its existence was brief. By 1524, the settlement had been abandoned, its population dispersed, relocated, or absorbed into other colonial centers. Official accounts describe a combination of factors: political instability, internal conflict, logistical strain, and the harsh realities of sustaining a settlement in a tropical environment far from established supply lines. In this interpretation, Santa María de la Antigua del Darién did not disappear suddenly. It was gradually rendered unsustainable. And yet, as with so many early colonial sites, the historical record leaves behind something less stable than closure. The written accounts from the period are fragmented. Some describe tensions between settlers and indigenous groups, others focus on internal disputes among colonial leaders, and still others emphasize the environmental challenges of the region: disease, flooding, and isolation. But when these accounts are placed side by side, they do not always form a continuous narrative. Instead, they create gaps, periods where the settlement is mentioned as active, and then, without detailed explanation, referenced as abandoned or relocated. What happened in those gaps? Mainstream historical interpretation suggests that Santa María de la Antigua del Darién suffered from a combination of predictable colonial pressures. The region was difficult to supply. Communication with Spain was slow and unreliable. Disease would have spread quickly in humid, densely populated conditions, and relations with local indigenous groups were complex, involving both exchange and conflict. In this view, the settlement's abandonment was not mysterious, but a logical outcome of unsustainable conditions. Yet even within this framework, certain details resist full closure. Archaeological efforts to locate the original settlement have faced significant challenges. The environment itself is dynamic. River systems shift, vegetation overtakes ruins, and organic materials decay rapidly in tropical climates. Unlike arid or temperate regions where stone foundations can endure for centuries, the rainforest actively absorbs human structures. What remains may be buried beneath layers of soil and root systems, invisible without extensive excavation. This environmental factor introduces a subtle but important possibility that parts of the settlement may still exist, not lost in the sense of being destroyed, but concealed beneath natural accumulation. Some researchers suggest that the population may not have simply vanished in place, but relocated in stages. As conditions in the original settlement became increasingly difficult, groups may have moved to other nearby colonial centers, such as Panama Viejo, or coastal sites that offered more stable access to resources and trade routes. In this scenario, the lost settlers were not lost at all, but redistributed across a growing colonial network. However, redistribution does not fully account for the sense of discontinuity in the historical record. Certain individuals and administrative references appear briefly and then fade, without clear documentation of their subsequent roles or locations. It is within these small absences that interpretive uncertainty begins to emerge. Could it be that the dissolution of Santa María de la Antigua del Darién was not a single event, but a gradual fading of identity as much as geography? Some speculative interpretations extend this idea further, suggesting that early colonial settlements in regions like Darién may have existed in more fluid states than formal records suggest. Rather than fixed urban centers, they may have functioned as shifting administrative hubs, relocating as conditions changed, rather than being definitively abandoned. If so, then what is described as disappearance might instead represent transformation into new forms of settlement that were recorded under different names. There are also indigenous perspectives that complicate the purely colonial narrative. Oral traditions in the broader region emphasize continuity of presence across changing landscapes, rather than fixed points of origin and disappearance. While these traditions do not directly map onto specific colonial settlements in written records, they suggest that human occupation of the region was continuous, even as European documentation appears intermittent. This raises an important interpretive tension, the difference between absence in the archive and absence in reality. The settlers of Santa María de la Antigua del Darién may have left behind limited physical traces, not because they disappeared entirely, but because the environment does not preserve their material footprint in a durable way. Wooden structures decay quickly in tropical climates. Metal corrodes. Organic materials are consumed by time and growth. In such conditions, archaeology depends heavily on indirect evidence, soil composition, artifact distribution, and spatial patterns that suggest prior habitation. Even when such evidence is found, it rarely produces a complete picture. Instead, it offers fragments, suggestions of habitation without full reconstruction of social life. And so the settlement remains partially visible, partially inferred, and partially absent. This partial visibility has led some historians to describe the Darién region as a threshold landscape, a place where European colonial ambitions first encountered environmental and logistical limits that reshaped their trajectory. Santa María de la Antigua del Darién, in this reading, is less a vanished city and more a transitional experiment that failed to stabilize long enough to become fully integrated into enduring colonial infrastructure. Yet even this interpretation does not fully resolve the sense of mystery that surrounds it. Why do some settlements leave behind continuous documentary traces, while others fade into discontinuity despite similar conditions? Why do certain names persist in historical memory, while others dissolve into administrative references without narrative detail? And what determines whether a settlement becomes a clearly defined historical entity or a briefly mentioned episode? These questions do not lead to definitive answers. Instead, they highlight the uneven nature of historical preservation itself. In rainforest environments like Darién, the passage of time does not merely obscure human activity. It actively transforms the physical record. Rivers shift course, floodplains expand, and vegetation reclaims open space with remarkable speed. A settlement that existed for a generation may leave behind only subtle traces within the geological and ecological layers that followed. Standing in the modern landscape of the region, it is difficult to distinguish between natural density and historical absence. The forest does not preserve outlines of former streets or structures in visible form. Instead, it absorbs them, integrating human presence into ecological continuity. Which leads to a final, lingering question. When we speak of the lost settlers of Santa Maria de la Antigua del Darién, are we referring to people who vanished, or to a settlement whose identity was gradually dissolved into a landscape that does not preserve distinction between human history and natural transformation? And if that boundary has truly blurred beyond recovery, then what other early colonial beginnings might still exist beneath the forest? Not as ruins waiting to be found, but as histories already absorbed into the living surface of the land itself. The question of whether Santa Maria de la Antigua del Darién was truly lost, or simply absorbed into a larger, less visible transformation, does not end in the rainforest. Instead, it lingers, like moisture in the air after a storm, present, but difficult to separate from everything around it. And as with so many early colonial sites, the uncertainty does not come from a lack of events, but from the way those events were recorded, transmitted, and eventually dispersed across competing narratives. In the years following the abandonment of Santa Maria de la Antigua del Darién, Spanish colonial activity in the region did not cease. It shifted. Administrative focus moved toward more strategically stable coastal settlements, where supply lines could be maintained and governance more reliably enforced. Inland regions like Darién, dense and difficult to traverse, gradually receded from the center of colonial planning. Yet the memory of the settlement did not vanish immediately. Early chronicles continued to reference it as a foundational site, an origin point for Spanish presence on the mainland. Over time, however, those references became more symbolic than descriptive. The details of daily life, the identities of lesser-known settlers, and the granular experiences of those who lived there began to fade from formal accounts. This gradual thinning of detail creates a particular kind of historical condition, a known place that becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct. Archaeological investigation in the Darién region has long faced obstacles that are both environmental and methodological. The rainforest does not preserve architecture in the same way as arid landscapes. Instead of exposed ruins, researchers encounter layered ecosystems where human traces are embedded beneath centuries of biological growth. In many cases, what survives is not structure, but pattern. Soil anomalies, scattered artifacts, and indirect indicators of prior occupation. These fragments suggest presence, but rarely continuity. They hint at activity without always confirming identity. Some scholars propose that this is precisely why Santa Maria de la Antigua del Darién continues to feel lost in a narrative sense, even though its historical existence is well documented. The settlement is not missing from history, it is fragmented within it. There are also broader structural reasons for this fragmentation. Early 16th century colonial record-keeping was uneven, especially in frontier regions. Communication between In the years following the abandonment of Santa Maria de la Antigua del Darién, Spanish colonial activity in the region did not cease. It shifted. Administrative focus moved toward more strategically stable coastal settlements, where supply lines could be maintained and governance more reliably enforced. Inland regions like Darién, dense and difficult to traverse, gradually receded from the center of colonial planning. Yet the memory of the settlement did not vanish immediately. Early chronicles continued to reference it as a foundational site, an origin point for Spanish presence on the mainland. Over time, however, those references became more symbolic than descriptive. The details of daily life, the identities of lesser-known settlers, and the granular experiences of those who lived there began to fade from formal accounts. This gradual thinning of detail creates a particular kind of historical condition, a known place that becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct. Archaeological investigation in the Darién region has long faced obstacles that are both environmental and methodological. The rainforest does not preserve architecture in the same way as arid landscapes. Instead of exposed ruins, researchers encounter layered ecosystems where human traces are embedded beneath centuries of biological growth. In many cases, what survives is not structure, but pattern. Soil anomalies, scattered artifacts, and indirect indicators of prior occupation. These fragments suggest presence, but rarely continuity. They hint at activity without always confirming identity. Some scholars propose that this is precisely why Santa María de la Antigua del Darién continues to feel lost in a narrative sense, even though its historical existence is well documented. The settlement is not missing from history, it is fragmented within it. There are also broader structural reasons for this fragmentation. Early 16th century colonial record-keeping was uneven, especially in frontier regions. Communication between the Americas and Spain required long maritime journeys, and documentation often passed through multiple hands before being archived. In that process, details could be condensed, altered, or omitted entirely. What survives is often a distilled version of events rather than a full account. Within that system, individuals who were not central to administrative or military decisions could easily become invisible in the historical record. Their presence is implied through collective references, settlers, colonists, residents, rather than preserved through personal narrative. Over time, this creates a subtle but significant effect. A population that existed in reality but becomes indistinct in documentation. It is within this space between collective record and individual absence that interpretations begin to diverge. One perspective holds that some speculative interpretations extend this idea further, suggesting that early colonial settlements in regions like Darién may have existed in more fluid spatial relationships than later historical models assume. Rather than fixed urban centers, they may have functioned as shifting nodes within a wider network of movement, relocating as conditions changed, expanding or contracting without clear boundaries. If so, then what appears as disappearance in the record may actually reflect a different form of organization that does not map neatly onto later administrative frameworks. Indigenous perspectives from the broader region emphasize continuity across space rather than permanence in place. Communities adapt to environmental cycles, seasonal changes, and shifting resource patterns. Within that worldview, movement does not necessarily imply loss. It can represent continuity expressed through relocation rather than static settlement. When these perspectives are placed alongside colonial records, a complex picture emerges, one where the same landscape is interpreted through different assumptions about permanence, structure, and visibility. Archaeology, in turn, operates between these frameworks. It seeks physical confirmation of presence, but must do so within an environment that actively reshapes its evidence. Every artifact recovered from the Darién region is already filtered through time, climate, and biological transformation. What remains is always partial, always situated within a larger field of absence. And so the lost settlers of Santa María de la Antigua del Darién become something more ambiguous than their name suggests. They are not simply missing individuals or erased populations. They are a reminder of how fragile continuity becomes when record-keeping, environment, and movement intersect in unstable ways. Standing in the modern Darién landscape, where dense forest stretches across terrain once occupied by one of the earliest colonial settlements in mainland America, it becomes difficult to separate history from ecology. The boundary between human construction and natural growth has long since dissolved. What remains is a landscape that carries history without displaying it in clear form. Which brings us back to the central uncertainty that follows this story. If Santa María de la Antigua del Darién has not truly vanished, but has instead been absorbed into a landscape that no longer distinguishes between settlement and environment, then what exactly are we trying to recover when we search for its lost settlers? The people themselves, the place they inhabited, or the historical form that once gave both of them definition? The uncertainty surrounding Santa María de la Antigua del Darién lingers in a familiar way, less as a disappearance and more as a fragmentation of record and meaning across time. It is the sense that something once coherent has been dispersed into fragments too small to fully reconstruct. That same sensation persists as the narrative shifts once again, away from the dense humidity of the rainforest and into a quieter, more abstract terrain, one made not of land or settlement, but of symbols, numbers, and the absence of their origin. In the early 19th century, in the rural landscape of Virginia, a small iron box is said to have been left in the care of an innkeeper in Bedford County. Inside it, according to later accounts, were 3 encrypted documents written in a dense sequence of numbers. These documents would eventually become known collectively as the Beale Ciphers. Unlike physical ruins or archaeological sites, the ciphers do not exist in a landscape that can be excavated in the traditional sense. They exist as text, structured, deliberate, and resistant to immediate interpretation. Their presence suggests intention, but their origin remains indistinct. And it is this gap between structure and source that defines the mystery more than anything contained within the codes themselves. The most widely circulated version of the story attributes the ciphers to a man named Thomas J. Beale, who is said to have led an expedition westward in search of precious metals. According to the narrative preserved in later publications, Beale and his associates discovered a vast treasure and encoded its location, contents, and intended distribution into 3 separate encrypted messages. The first cipher was intended to describe the treasure itself. The second was said to identify its location. The third was meant to list the individuals entitled to its division. The documents were eventually associated with a figure identified in later accounts as Robert Morris, who reportedly attempted to decode them without success. After this failure, the ciphers remained unresolved, eventually surfacing in printed form decades later through a pamphlet known as the Beale Papers. From that moment onward, the mystery bifurcates into 2 parallel uncertainties: the meaning of the ciphers themselves and the origin of the narrative that surrounds them. Mainstream historical interpretation often approaches the Beale story with skepticism. The absence of corroborating documentation for Beale's expedition, the lack of independent verification of the treasure discovery, and the late emergence of the pamphlet all suggest that the story may be a literary construction rather than a documented historical event. In this reading, the ciphers function as an elaborate puzzle embedded within a narrative framework designed to evoke curiosity rather than preserve factual history. Yet, even within this skeptical framework, the ciphers themselves resist dismissal. They are not random sequences. They appear structured, internally consistent, and aligned with known encryption techniques of the period. This structural coherence is part of what has sustained interest in them for nearly 2 centuries. And so the question persists: if the story is fictional, why does the cipher system behave as though it encodes something real? Some interpretations suggest that the Beale ciphers may have been created as a form of intellectual exercise or cryptographic challenge, detached from any actual treasure. In this view, the lost source is not a physical expedition or hidden vault, but the original intention behind the creation of the code itself. If the author of the ciphers was never documented, then the source becomes a kind of absence within authorship, a missing origin point rather than a missing location. Other perspectives approach the story differently, treating it as potentially rooted in real events that were later obscured through time, repetition, and narrative transformation. In this interpretation, Beale may have existed, and the expedition may have occurred, but the documentary chain that would normally anchor such a story in verifiable history was never fully preserved. Frontier record-keeping in the early 19th century was uneven, especially for private expeditions operating outside formal governmental or military oversight. If this were the case, the lost source of the ciphers would not be fictional invention, but incomplete archival survival. The original records, journals, correspondence, or logistical notes may have existed at one point but were never integrated into institutional archives. Over time, only the encrypted remnants remained, separated from the context that would allow them to be fully understood. This possibility introduces a subtle but important shift in the nature of the mystery. It is no longer only about decoding information, but about reconstructing the conditions under which that information was produced. Without that context, even a successful decryption might fail to fully explain the system that generated it. The first of the three ciphers is widely considered to have been solved using a key derived from the United States Declaration of Independence. The solution reportedly reveals an inventory of gold, silver, and jewels attributed to the Beale group. However, the remaining two ciphers have resisted all attempts at definitive decryption. This partial success has only deepened the ambiguity. One section yields meaning, while the others remain opaque. Why would a system be partially accessible and partially resistant if it originated from a single coherent method? Or does the structure itself depend on a missing key, one that was never recovered alongside the documents? This question has led some researchers into more speculative territory. One idea suggests that the Beale ciphers may have been designed with a layered encryption system, where only partial access was intended without the original reference material. In this interpretation, the lost source is not the narrative of Beale, but the keying system that governs the remaining encrypted texts. Without it, the ciphers remain structurally intact, but functionally incomplete. Another perspective considers the possibility that the ciphers are not uniform in origin. The first cipher, which has been partially decoded, may have been constructed differently from the others, suggesting multiple authorship or multiple stages of encoding. If true, this would imply that the source of the ciphers is not singular but composite, assembled over time, perhaps by different hands, under different intentions. Yet despite these interpretations, no definitive evidence has emerged to confirm the existence of Beale's expedition, the treasure, or the original encryption context. What remains is the text itself, detached from verifiable origin. This detachment is what continues to define the mystery. In historical terms, most encoded documents are eventually resolved through contextual recovery. Keys are found, related documents are discovered, or parallel records confirm origin. The Beale ciphers, however, remain isolated. They exist without a surrounding documentary ecosystem that can stabilize their meaning. This isolation is what has allowed the mystery to persist across generations of cryptographers, historians, and independent researchers. Each attempt at interpretation builds a temporary framework of understanding, only to encounter structural resistance in the remaining undecoded sequences. And so the lost source becomes increasingly difficult to define. Is it the missing expedition? The missing key? The missing authorial intent? Or is it the absence of contextual continuity that would normally allow such a system to be anchored in historical reality? In a broader sense, the Beale ciphers occupy a space similar to other historical uncertainties explored earlier in this narrative: lost settlements, vanished witnesses, fragmented records. In each case, what is missing is not always the event itself, but the continuity that would allow that event to be fully integrated into historical understanding. Standing back from the accumulation of interpretations, one question remains quietly unresolved. If the Beale ciphers were created with a source that has since been lost, whether physical, documentary, or conceptual, then what exactly survives within the codes we still possess? Are they a message waiting for a key that no longer exists? Or are they the final fragment of a larger narrative that has already dissolved beyond recovery, leaving only structure behind without origin, context, or completion? The absence of a clear origin for the Beale ciphers does not simply leave a gap in historical understanding. It creates a kind of suspended uncertainty, where structure exists without anchoring context. That uncertainty begins to echo outward, much like earlier mysteries where settlements, witnesses, or entire communities seem to fade not through a single moment of loss, but through the gradual disappearance of the systems that once held them together. As the Beale narrative continues to circulate through time, it becomes increasingly detached from any verifiable point of origin. The iron box said to have been entrusted in Bedford County remains unverified in any archival record. The supposed expedition into the American West leaves no contemporaneous documentation outside of the later pamphlet tradition. And yet the encrypted texts themselves persist, copied, analyzed, and reinterpreted across generations. This tension between absence of source and persistence of structure has led researchers to focus not only on what the ciphers contain, but on how they have survived without an identifiable documentary foundation. The publication most responsible for shaping modern understanding of the story, the Beale Papers, functions as both narrative origin and interpretive frame. It introduces the idea of Thomas J. Beale, the hidden treasure, and the encoded instructions, while simultaneously standing as the sole widely circulated source for the entire account. This singularity is unusual in historical terms. Most events are corroborated through multiple independent records. The Beale story is not. And yet, the structure of the ciphers themselves resists being dismissed as purely incidental. They are systematic, layered, and internally consistent in ways that suggest deliberate construction. This has kept them within the domain of cryptographic study rather than folklore alone. Some interpretations propose that the Beale ciphers were designed as a self-contained intellectual artifact, intended to function independently of historical validation. In this view, the lost source is not a physical expedition or hidden treasure, but the conceptual framework in which the ciphers were created. Once that framework was separated from its author, only the encrypted residue remained. Others take a different approach, suggesting that the story may have originated in a real event that was later transformed through retelling, abstraction, and publication. If an initial expedition or discovery did occur, the absence of supporting documentation could reflect the informal nature of frontier activity in the early 19th century. Private ventures, unrecorded agreements, and oral transmission all had the potential to leave behind incomplete archival traces. In that scenario, the missing element is not necessarily the ciphers themselves, but the contextual materials that would normally surround them: journals, correspondence, logistical records, or personal testimony. Without these, even a genuine historical event could become structurally indistinguishable from constructed narrative over time. This ambiguity introduces a deeper question. How much of historical certainty depends not on the existence of events, but on the survival of their documentation? Attempts to decode the remaining Beale ciphers have continued for decades, using increasingly sophisticated computational methods. Frequency analysis, pattern recognition, and linguistic modeling have all been applied, yet no universally accepted solution has emerged for the unresolved texts. The partial success of the first cipher, reportedly decoded using the United States Declaration of Independence, has only intensified scrutiny of the remaining two, suggesting that the system may rely on a key or reference that has not yet been identified. If such a key once existed, its absence becomes central to the mystery. It implies that the ciphers are not fully self-contained, but dependent on an external reference system that has been lost or was never publicly revealed. This idea of dependency without access mirrors other historical uncertainties. In earlier cases examined in this narrative, the abandoned settlements along the Guale coast, the fragmented records of frontier missions, the missing archival continuity of Arctic expeditions, meaning often collapses not because events did not occur, but because the interpretive structures that once supported them are no longer intact. In that sense, the Beale ciphers can be seen as part of a broader pattern, historical artifacts that survive without their surrounding context. Some speculative interpretations extend this idea further, suggesting that the ciphers may represent a deliberately constructed system of layered concealment, designed to resist interpretation unless viewed through a specific, now-lost framework. In this view, the lost source is not merely documentary, but methodological, a way of thinking or encoding that has not survived into modern analytical practice. However, there is no evidence to confirm such a system existed beyond the structure of the ciphers themselves. What remains is inference built upon absence, and absence, in this case, is unusually stable. It does not resolve over time. It persists. Even as historical research advances, no new primary documents have emerged to confirm the origin of the Beale narrative. No independent expedition records, no contemporaneous accounts, and no material evidence have been found that directly connect the ciphers to a documented treasure recovery or burial. The story remains anchored primarily in its own textual existence. This creates a rare condition in historical study, an artifact that generates extensive analysis while resisting integration into a broader verified framework. And so the question of the lost source continues to shift shape depending on how it is approached. Is it the missing author behind the ciphers? The missing expedition that supposedly generated them? The missing key that would unlock their structure? Or the missing historical continuity that would normally bind all of these elements into a single coherent narrative? Each possibility reframes the mystery without fully resolving it. Standing at this intersection of interpretation, one final uncertainty emerges. If the Beale ciphers were ever connected to a real source, whether physical, documentary, or conceptual, then what remains in their encrypted form is not just a puzzle, but a remnant of something that has already been separated from the conditions that made it meaningful. And if that separation is irreversible, then the ciphers may not be waiting to be solved in the traditional sense. They may already be complete in themselves, with everything that once gave them context now existing only outside the boundaries of what has survived. The question of origin, of where a mystery truly begins, has followed this narrative from encoded texts to vanished settlements, from fragmented archives to stories that survive without verifiable roots. Each case has suggested a similar pattern. Something once structured becomes separated from its context, leaving behind only traces that resist full reconstruction. And as that pattern continues, it reappears once more, this time not in a document, nor in a rainforest, nor in an abandoned colony, but in a small, unassuming island off the coast of Nova Scotia. From above, the island appears almost ordinary. A low, forested stretch of land surrounded by cold Atlantic waters, its shoreline shaped by tides and storms that have carved the eastern Canadian coast for millennia. Dense oak trees dominate its interior, their roots twisting through soil that hides more than it reveals. The wind moves constantly across the surface, carrying salt and mist inland, as if the ocean itself is reluctant to release the land from its influence. This is Oak Island, a place that, for more than 2 centuries, has drawn attention not because of what is clearly visible, but because of what is suspected to lie beneath. The earliest recorded interest in the island's mystery dates back to the late 18th century, when accounts began circulating of unusual depressions in the ground near its eastern end. According to later retellings, a young man exploring the island reportedly noticed a circular indentation that appeared too deliberate to be natural. The soil in that area seemed disturbed in a way that suggested previous excavation, though no clear explanation was immediately available. What followed was not a single discovery, but a gradual unfolding of curiosity. Early digging efforts revealed layers of earth, timber, and compacted material arranged in a pattern that seemed artificial. At intervals, wooden platforms were reportedly encountered, stacked one above another, separated by layers of soil and organic debris. These findings did not immediately suggest treasure in any direct sense, but they did suggest intent. Someone, at some point, had engineered a structured underground formation. And yet, no clear record exists explaining who created it or why. Mainstream historical interpretation tends to approach these early accounts cautiously. Much of the earliest documentation is based on oral tradition, later written down and shaped by repeated retelling. In this view, the initial discovery may have been real, but its interpretation quickly expanded beyond what the physical evidence could definitively support. Natural geological formations, shifting sediment layers, and tree root systems can sometimes create patterns that resemble human construction, especially when observed without modern archaeological context. Still, even within cautious interpretation, one detail continues to stand out: the repeated reports of structured layering beneath the ground. Over time, the story of Oak Island evolved from localized curiosity into a sustained search effort. Excavations became more organized, tools improved, investment increased. What began as small-scale digging eventually developed into large, coordinated attempts to reach whatever lay beneath the surface. But each stage of excavation seemed to introduce new complications rather than resolution. Water flooding became one of the most persistent obstacles. As deeper layers were reached, shafts reportedly filled with seawater through interconnected underground channels. Attempts to drain or bypass these water intrusions often led to further structural collapse or unexpected inflow patterns. These challenges gave rise to one of the most enduring features of the Oak Island narrative: the idea of a deliberately engineered flood system. According to this interpretation, the underground structure may have been designed with protective mechanisms intended to prevent access to deeper levels. If true, this would suggest not only excavation, but planning, an intentional effort to secure something beneath the surface. However, alternative explanations exist. Geological studies of the region have suggested that natural limestone formations and subterranean water pathways could account for sudden flooding events. In this view, the water is not evidence of engineered defense, but of complex natural hydrology interacting with deep excavation attempts. The tension between these interpretations has never fully resolved. As excavations continued into the 19th and 20th centuries, more artifacts were reportedly recovered from various depths: wood fragments, metal objects, and traces of human modification. Some of these findings were later lost, damaged, or disputed in their interpretation, making it difficult to construct a single consistent archaeological record. And yet, the persistence of excavation itself becomes part of the mystery. Why does a site continue to attract sustained effort across generations, even when definitive results remain elusive? Some researchers suggest that the answer lies not only in what has been found, but in what has been consistently suggested. Over time, reports of inscriptions, stone markers, and unusual structural features began to circulate. One of the most frequently referenced elements is a stone reportedly inscribed with symbols or coded markings discovered during early excavation efforts. The original stone has not survived in verifiable form, but sketches and descriptions of it continue to appear in later accounts. These fragments contributed to the idea that the island might contain not just buried objects, but a deliberately encoded system, one that requires interpretation rather than simple excavation. This interpretation brings the Oak Island mystery closer, conceptually, to the earlier Beale cipher narrative. In both cases, structure exists without accessible origin. In both cases, meaning appears partially recoverable but never fully complete. And in both cases, the absence of a verifiable source becomes central to the mystery itself. Yet Oak Island differs in one critical way. It is physically tangible. Unlike encoded texts or fragmented records, the island can be measured, excavated, and observed directly. And still, certainty remains elusive. Over time, various theories have emerged attempting to explain what might lie beneath the island. Some suggest buried pirate treasure, hidden during periods of maritime conflict in the Atlantic. Others propose more elaborate possibilities: secret military deposits, lost colonial archives, or transatlantic transfers of wealth during periods of political upheaval in Europe. None of these theories has been conclusively proven. And yet, none has been entirely dismissed either, because the physical evidence remains incomplete. There is also a more restrained historical interpretation, which suggests that the island's mystery may have been amplified by cumulative excavation itself. Each generation of diggers builds upon the interpretations of those before them, creating a layered narrative that becomes increasingly complex over time. In this view, Oak Island is not a single mystery, but a convergence of multiple investigative efforts, each adding interpretation to partial data. And still, that explanation does not fully account for the consistency of structural anomalies reported across different excavation periods. Even as technology has advanced, allowing for ground-penetrating radar and more precise geological mapping, the island has continued to produce ambiguous results. Some surveys suggest irregular subsurface formations. Others indicate more ordinary geological variation. The lack of definitive consensus has ensured that interpretation remains open-ended. This openness is part of what sustains the mystery. Because Oak Island is not only about what lies beneath the ground, it is about what happens when interpretation persists without resolution. Each generation inherits not just the site itself, but the accumulated expectations of those who came before. And so the island becomes layered not only physically, but conceptually. Earth, timber, water, and speculation all coexist in a system where separation between fact and interpretation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Some speculative interpretations propose that the site may never have contained a single hidden object or cache at all, but instead represents a convergence point of multiple smaller events: early construction, later excavation attempts, natural geological processes, and narrative amplification over time. In this view, the treasure is not a single buried object, but the accumulation of human engagement with uncertainty itself. However, even this interpretation leaves unanswered the question of origin. Why did structured digging appear so early in the island's recorded history? What prompted the initial excavation patterns that sparked centuries of continued interest? And why do certain subsurface features continue to resist simple geological explanation? The deeper the inquiry becomes, the more the island seems to shift between categories: natural formation, historical site, engineered structure, and narrative construct. Standing at the shoreline today, the island appears unchanged in its fundamental geography. Trees still cover its surface. The wind still moves through its interior. The tides still reshape its edges. And yet beneath that apparent stability lies a history defined by repeated interruption. Excavation without completion, interpretation without finality, and discovery without closure. Which brings the mystery back to its most persistent question. If Oak Island does contain something significant beneath its surface, then why has it remained so resistant to definitive recovery? And if it does not, then what exactly has driven centuries of sustained belief that something meaningful must still be waiting below the layers of earth, water, and time? As the narrative of Oak Island continues to unfold across generations, it begins to resemble less a single unresolved site and more a long-term dialogue between expectation and resistance. Each attempt to reach its depths adds another layer, not only of excavation, but of interpretation, assumption, and inherited belief. And in that sense, the island becomes part of a broader pattern already seen across earlier mysteries, places where absence itself seems structured, almost intentional in its persistence. The more excavation progressed into the modern era, the more the island revealed a paradox. On one hand, there were increasingly sophisticated surveys, drilling techniques, and geological studies designed to eliminate uncertainty. On the other hand, the results rarely converged into a single, universally accepted explanation. Instead, they produced overlapping interpretations, some suggesting natural formation, others pointing toward possible human engineering at varying depths and periods. This divergence is part of what keeps Oak Island central in discussions of unexplained historical sites. It is not simply that something has not been found, but that the evidence itself seems to resist collapsing into one stable narrative. Earlier excavation efforts had already established a pattern that would define later investigation. The deeper the search went, the more complex the structure appeared to become. Wooden layers reportedly encountered in early digs were followed by reports of clay, charcoal, and irregular stone formations. Some interpretations suggested deliberate stratification. Others argued these could result from natural sinkhole activity, repeated collapse, or the accumulation of debris over time. But even when natural explanations are applied, they do not fully erase the sense of intentionality described in early accounts. This tension between interpretation and material uncertainty is what transforms Oak Island from a local legend into a sustained historical problem. By the 19th century, the site had already attracted organized excavation efforts, often funded by private groups seeking to resolve what earlier generations had only partially documented. These efforts introduced more systematic approaches, measured shafts, recorded depths, and attempts to map subsurface anomalies. Yet despite these improvements, definitive confirmation of a central buried cache remained elusive. Instead, what emerged was a growing collection of partial findings, fragments of wood at unusual depths, indications of possible man-made disturbances in soil layering, and water intrusion patterns that complicated excavation stability. Each discovery suggested possibility without delivering conclusion. This pattern of near resolution is one of the most persistent features of the Oak Island narrative. It is not a simple absence of evidence, but a repeated encounter with evidence that resists final interpretation. Some researchers have proposed that this resistance may itself be structural. One interpretation suggests that the island's subsurface environment could be naturally prone to complex water channels and sediment shifts, producing formations that mimic engineered constructs under certain conditions. In this view, the perception of deliberate design may arise from the intersection of geology and expectation. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the consistency of early descriptions, which predate modern excavation methods and geological theory. Those early accounts describe structured layers in a way that suggests repeated observation rather than isolated misinterpretation. This is where speculation inevitably expands. Alternative theories propose that Oak Island may have served as a temporary storage site for valuable materials during periods of maritime instability in the Atlantic world. The region's history of trade, conflict, and shifting colonial control provides a backdrop in which concealment would have been a practical strategy. In this interpretation, any buried material may have been deliberately protected, with mechanisms designed to prevent easy access. However, no definitive historical record has been found to confirm such an operation at the scale suggested by the legend. Other interpretations move further into abstraction, suggesting that the island's significance may not lie in a single buried object at all. Instead, it may represent a convergence point where multiple smaller historical events, excavations, and natural processes have accumulated into a single narrative structure over time. In this sense, the treasure becomes less a physical object and more a narrative artifact, something created by centuries of sustained attention. Yet even this conceptual framing leaves unanswered questions about the earliest reports that initiated the mystery in the first place. Why did systematic digging begin at that specific location? What first prompted the interpretation that something structured lay beneath the surface? And why did those early impressions persist long enough to generate centuries of continued investigation? These questions remain open not because they lack answers entirely, but because the available evidence does not converge cleanly on any single explanation. Over time, technological advances have added new dimensions to the investigation. Ground-penetrating radar, sonar mapping, and modern drilling techniques have all been applied to the island's subsurface. Some surveys have identified anomalies that warrant further study. Others have found nothing beyond expected geological variation. The coexistence of these results reinforces the island's ambiguity rather than resolving it. In many ways, Oak Island now exists in two parallel states: the physical landscape itself and the interpretive landscape built around it. The former is measurable and finite. The latter is cumulative and expanding. And it is within that interpretive layer that the mystery continues to evolve. The longer the search persists, the more the island becomes a record of human persistence in the face of uncertainty. Each generation brings new tools, new theories, and new expectations, yet the core question remains unchanged. Something is either there, partially there, or was never there in the form originally imagined. All possibilities remain active, none fully eliminated. This unresolved condition is what connects Oak Island back to the broader thread running through these mysteries. The Beale ciphers without a confirmed origin, settlements that dissolve into fragmented records, encoded systems that resist completion. In each case, structure exists without closure. Standing on the shoreline today, looking inward across the oak-covered terrain, the island offers no visible indication of what lies beneath. The surface appears ordinary, continuous, unbroken. And yet beneath that surface lies a century-spanning accumulation of inquiry, excavation, and interpretation, which leads, once again, to the central question that has never fully left the story. If Oak Island contains nothing of significance, then why does it continue to generate patterns of evidence that suggest otherwise? And if it does contain something, then what force, natural, historical, or structural, has kept it so persistently beyond final discovery? Oak Island leaves behind a familiar kind of uncertainty, one where physical evidence exists but refuses to settle into a final explanation. That same tension between what is seen and what cannot be conclusively proven appears again when history shifts from buried landscapes to something far more intimate. Human remains, identity, and the fragile certainty of bones that may or may not belong to those they are said to represent. In the heart of London, beneath the layered stone and shadow of centuries of political transformation, stands Westminster Abbey. Its corridors hold the resting places of monarchs, statesmen, and figures who shaped the direction of English history. The Abbey is not simply a burial site, it is an archive in stone, where identity, authority, and memory are preserved through monumental architecture and ceremonial tradition. It is within this broader historical landscape that one of England's most enduring royal uncertainties persists: the fate of the young heirs known as the princes in the Tower. In 1483, during a period of intense political instability, two boys, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were lodged in the Tower of London under the protection of their uncle, who would later become King Richard III. The tower itself, now known as Tower of London, was at that time both a royal residence and a secure fortress. It was intended to be a place of protection. Yet, in the context of late 15th century succession disputes, protection and imprisonment often became indistinguishable. The boys were last reliably recorded within the tower. After that point, historical documentation becomes fragmented. Their public appearances ceased. Administrative references fade. And over time, the question of what happened to them becomes one of the most persistent, unresolved mysteries in English royal history. Contemporary accounts from the period offer competing interpretations, but none provide direct, verifiable observation of their fate. Some chronicles written during and shortly after the reign of Richard III suggest that the princes were removed from public view and ultimately died within the tower. Other accounts, produced during the Tudor period that followed, present more explicit claims that they were murdered, with suspicion directed toward Richard III himself. However, these narratives were shaped within highly politicized environments. The transition between dynasties meant that historical writing was often influenced by the need to legitimize new authority. As a result, separating factual observation from political narrative becomes increasingly difficult. The question of what happened to the princes is therefore not only a question of events, but of evidence, interpretation, and the survival of records shaped by competing power structures. For centuries, the physical question, what happened to their bodies, remained unresolved. Then, in 1674, during construction work within the Tower of London, workers reportedly discovered a wooden chest beneath a staircase. Inside were the skeletal remains of 2 children. The discovery immediately attracted attention, and the bones were soon associated with the long-missing princes. The remains were later placed in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today, attributed to Edward V and his brother Richard. But attribution is not the same as certainty. At the time of their discovery, forensic science as it is understood today did not exist. Identification relied heavily on circumstantial association, location, context, and historical expectation. The bones were found in a place connected to the princes, during a period when their disappearance was still part of public memory. From this, the assumption was made that the remains must belong to them. Yet no definitive scientific analysis was possible at the time of discovery, and the bones have never been subjected to modern genetic testing. This leaves open a critical gap between historical attribution and biological confirmation. It is within this gap that the mystery continues to exist. Mainstream historical interpretation often accepts the likelihood that the bones may indeed belong to the princes, based on contextual probability. The location of discovery, combined with the absence of any other known candidates from that site and period, supports this assumption. In this view, the mystery is largely considered resolved in practical terms, even if not scientifically confirmed. However, this conclusion is not universally accepted. Some historians point to inconsistencies in the original excavation records. The documentation from the 17th century is limited and lacks the methodological precision expected in modern archaeological practice. The exact stratigraphic context of the discovery is unclear. The chain of custody for the remains is not fully documented by contemporary standards. These gaps do not disprove the identification, but they prevent it from being definitively established. Other interpretations suggest that the remains could belong to different children entirely, possibly victims of unrelated events within the tower's long and complex history. As a royal fortress, prison, and residence, the tower was occupied by numerous individuals over centuries, and the presence of unidentified remains is not, in itself, unusual. Still, the specific association with the princes persists because of the narrative weight attached to their disappearance. The story of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury is not only about two missing individuals. It is about the uncertainty surrounding succession, legitimacy, and historical memory during a period of political transformation. Their disappearance represents a break in continuity that later generations attempted to resolve through narrative reconstruction. This is where the mystery begins to extend beyond the physical remains. If the bones discovered in the tower are not definitively identified, then the princes themselves remain in a state of historical ambiguity. They exist simultaneously as documented individuals and unresolved absences. The records confirm their presence up to a certain point, then fall silent. What follows that silence is a space filled by interpretation. Some accounts suggest they were murdered shortly after their confinement, possibly to eliminate potential claims to the throne. Others propose alternative scenarios, including the possibility that they were moved or hidden for political reasons. A smaller number of fringe interpretations suggest survival and escape, though these lack supporting documentary evidence and are not widely accepted in academic history. What is consistent across all interpretations is the absence of direct, continuous evidence after their disappearance from public view. The bones in Westminster Abbey, housed within Westminster Abbey, therefore function less as definitive answers and more as symbolic anchors. They represent an attempt to close a historical gap that has resisted full closure for more than 5 centuries. And yet, even within that symbolic resolution, uncertainty remains embedded. Without modern forensic analysis, including DNA comparison to known descendants or advanced isotopic testing, the identification cannot move beyond probabilistic interpretation. But even such testing, if conducted, might not fully resolve the historical narrative. It could confirm biological identity without clarifying historical circumstance, because the mystery is not only about who the bones belong to, but about what happened in the space between documented presence and recorded absence. That space is where history becomes most fragile. The Tower of London still stands, its stone walls layered with centuries of political transformation. Visitors walk through its corridors, viewing both reconstructed and original structures, moving through spaces that once held prisoners, royalty, and soldiers. Yet the specific moment when the princes disappeared remains inaccessible, not because the location is unknown, but because the transition from presence to absence was never fully documented. In this sense, the mystery persists not at the level of geography, but at the level of narrative continuity. And so the question remains open, suspended between archaeology, history, and interpretation. If the bones in Westminster Abbey truly belong to Edward V and his brother Richard, then what exactly explains the silence that surrounds their final days in the tower? And if they do not, then where, within the layered history of that fortress, does their story truly end? The uncertainty surrounding the princes in the tower does not end with the question of the bones. In many ways, that discovery, whether accepted or questioned, marks not a conclusion, but a point where the historical record briefly becomes tangible before dissolving again into interpretation. The silence that follows their disappearance from the written accounts of the late 15th century remains just as significant as any later attempt to fill it. In the years following their confinement within the Tower of London, references to Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury gradually fade from official records. The political landscape of England shifts rapidly during this period, as claims to the throne are contested and reshaped through conflict and succession. Within this environment, documentation becomes increasingly selective, shaped by authority and survival rather than neutral preservation. The tower itself, known today as Tower of London, retains its role as both symbol and structure. It is a place where royal authority was exercised, but also where control over individuals and over narratives was physically enforced. Within its stone walls, presence could be recorded, but absence was far harder to define. The discovery in 1674 of 2 sets of child-sized skeletal remains beneath a staircase added a new layer to this long-standing uncertainty. Those remains, later placed in Westminster Abbey, were interpreted within the cultural and historical framework available at the time. But interpretation is not the same as confirmation, and the distance between those two concepts continues to define the modern debate. Without modern forensic verification, the identification of the bones remains circumstantial. Their location within the tower provides strong associative context, but not definitive proof. This distinction is critical because it preserves the gap between historical narrative and biological certainty, a gap that continues to resist closure. Some historians argue that even if the remains are not conclusively proven to belong to the princes, the broader historical trajectory still points toward their deaths during or shortly after their disappearance from public view. In this reading, the absence of further records is itself evidence of a likely outcome, shaped by the political realities of the time. Others remain more cautious, emphasizing the limitations of retrospective interpretation. The late 15th century was a period of intense dynastic instability. Records were often incomplete, and later accounts were frequently shaped by political motivations that complicate attempts at neutral reconstruction. Within this framework, the disappearance of the princes remains a documented fact, but the circumstances surrounding it remain open. What becomes clear is that the mystery does not hinge solely on the physical remains. It also rests on the structure of historical silence itself. Why do certain individuals vanish from records in ways that leave no clear administrative trace? Why do some events produce continuous documentation, while others dissolve into fragmented references and retrospective interpretation? And in cases like this, where political transformation is underway, how much of what is missing reflects deliberate omission versus simple archival loss? These questions extend beyond the tower and into the broader mechanisms of historical preservation. In the centuries following their disappearance, the story of the princes became deeply embedded in English historical memory. It was retold in chronicles, adapted in political narratives, and reinterpreted across generations. Each retelling added detail, emphasis, or perspective, gradually shaping a story that is both historically anchored and narratively fluid. This layering of interpretation is part of what keeps the mystery active. The princes are not only historical figures, they are also symbols within a broader discourse about legitimacy, power, and unresolved succession. Some speculative interpretations suggest that the ambiguity surrounding their fate may have been intentionally preserved at certain points in history, either to maintain political stability or to avoid reopening contested claims. While there is no direct evidence for deliberate preservation of ambiguity, the possibility highlights how historical narratives can sometimes stabilize around uncertainty rather than resolution. Other interpretations focus on the physical environment of the tower itself. As a multi-purpose royal fortress, it contained numerous chambers, passageways, and storage spaces. Over centuries, structural modifications may have altered or obscured original layouts. In this context, the location where the remains were discovered in the 17th century could represent only one part of a much larger and partially undocumented spatial history. Yet even these architectural considerations do not fully resolve the core uncertainty. The question remains not only where the princes might have been, but what sequence of events led to their disappearance from contemporary observation. At the center of this uncertainty is a fundamental tension between documentation and absence. The historical record confirms their existence up to a certain point, then transitions into silence. That silence is later filled by interpretation, discovery, and attribution, but never fully replaced by direct evidence. This is where the bones, whether correctly identified or not, take on symbolic weight. They represent an attempt to bridge that silence, to provide physical closure to a narrative gap that has persisted for centuries. But symbolic resolution is not the same as evidential resolution, and so the uncertainty remains layered. Even modern historical analysis, with its emphasis on critical source evaluation, cannot fully eliminate the interpretive distance between record and reality in this case. The available evidence supports plausible conclusions, but not definitive closure. The result is a historical condition where probability and uncertainty coexist without full reconciliation. Standing within the present-day corridors of the Tower of London, the physical space remains unchanged in its fundamental structure, even as its meaning has evolved. Visitors move through rooms that once held political prisoners, royal figures, and state actors whose lives intersected with moments of decisive historical change. Yet the specific moment when the princes ceased to be recorded remains inaccessible, preserved only in fragmented accounts and later interpretation. This absence of resolution is what sustains the mystery, because the question is no longer only about what happened to Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury. It is also about how history itself handles moments where documentation stops, where interpretation begins, and where physical evidence, if it exists, cannot fully restore narrative continuity. And so the final uncertainty remains quietly intact. If the remains in Westminster Abbey are truly those of the princes, then the mystery narrows but does not disappear. And if they are not, then the question of their fate returns entirely to the silence of the historical record, where presence once ended and where absence has never fully explained itself.